was helping my parents clean out their garage a while back when I found an absolute time capsule. A personal video game codebook featuring every game I owned on all the consoles I'd grown, or was still growing up with. I love how my younger self couldn't just have a stack of codes printed off of the internet. No, he had to 3-hole punch them, put them in a binder, organize them chronologically by the console that they were released on, and separate each console with a cover page eulogizing the years it was on the market. When it came to my schoolwork, I couldn't stay organized to save my life, but when it came to something important, oh, then it mattered. Of course, he even printed a cover for the book and emblazoned it with the title screen of the game that taught him what a video game was. The glory days of 16-bit. And for a reference material he was making purely for himself, a book that he had no reason to think anyone else would ever see, he wrote a foreword. Words of wisdom right here. All too often, a game that was originally made in the 16-bit days is upgraded to 3D, and every single time, the game's original formula loses something. It is difficult to figure out what that something is. Sure, the graphics are great, but the gameplay is not solid. The games covered in this codebook are prime examples of what makes 16-bit great. That something missing in the new games can be found in spades in these games. And then he signed it, Josh Wallen, June 5th, 2001. Huh. So this was a couple of weeks after my 13th birthday. For that birthday, I'd gotten this. A collection of Genesis games, albeit with terrible sound emulation, ported to the Dreamcast. I had, with intent, spent the last moments I would ever have as a preteen finishing the first game in the video game series that had defined my childhood. I was already feeling more than a little wistful about the death of the Dreamcast, the end of Sega's console legacy, and the coincidentally coinciding end of my childhood.
Now, Virtua Fighter 2 contains graphics that were state-of-the-art in 1995.
I bring this up because the instruction book for Sega Smash Pack also had a foreword, and reading it the day that I turned 13 brought tears to my eyes. Lo and behold, the one I wrote in my codebook is blatantly plagiarizing it. But cut me some slack. I might not have thought so, but I was still just a kid. But that contradiction just speaks to where I was back then. This book itself is a testament to the reverence that I felt for games that were, at the time, not even a decade old. Some of them weren't even close. I couldn't have explained why I felt that way then, but I've had a while to think about it. Nowadays, I think it'd be silly to think that a game from just 6 years ago was some kind of decrepit, antiquated relic. But this was a different time. Breakthrough advancement at a breakneck pace. This defined the industry. A new game, a new genre, a new technology would come along and set a whole new standard for graphical fidelity that would make the old standard look quaint by comparison. And in the space of just a few years, even that would be outmoded 100 times. Gaming back then changed so much, so fast. And 2001 was the year that everything changed. It was the end of Sega's console line and the start of Microsoft's. With the arrival of the Xbox and the GameCube that fall, the next generation was finally just the current generation. But it wasn't just that new consoles were coming out. The very syntax of how games were made was changing. Devs no longer necessarily had to design games in such a way that they would be difficult for players so that they'd feel like they were getting their money's worth, or make it so that playing the same levels over and over again would be rewarding. Cartridges were no more. Every console now used DVDs as a storage medium, and games were finally getting to the point where they could just last. And if you want your clothes to last, then look no further than this episode's sponsor, Chimera. Yeah, I turned so slowly my beard came in. Chimera's clothes are made of ethically produced premium materials, but their prices are comparable to what you'd pay for a wafer-thin t-shirt in a department store. Hang on, who are these people? I thought we were using the better footage this time. Can we run the... Yeah, that's what I'm talking about! Seriously, Chimera's clothes absolutely pwn everything else in my closet, to use the parlance of the time. They're cool and comfy, and after months of wearing them, they still look brand new. Chimera's recently introduced some awesome new pieces? Is that the term? You can find a piece you like and use my code GEEK to save 10% on your order. All joking aside, thank you for helping me out, guys. So, Don't let somebody set up you the bomb. Make sure all your base or belong to Chimera. Right, so, 2001. Just 6 years earlier, the struggle between these two superpowers had defined console gaming. But now Sega was out, and Nintendo... Oh, Nintendo. Every Nintendo console to that point had launched, at least internationally, alongside a masterpiece of a Mario game, a title that inevitably raised the bar and set the standard against which all other games would be judged. If I can borrow a phrase from Jeremy Parish's excellent NES Work series, at the time each of these titles came out, it would not have been an exaggeration to argue that it was the best game of all time. And then... This was, unfortunately for it, the pedigree that Luigi's Mansion was up against, and say what you will about it, it meant the GameCube launch did not have that kind of impact. Nintendo had always strived to be better than, but the GameCube was the point where they started striving instead to be different. This worked out for them eventually, but at the time, it was a jarring change for longtime Nintendo fans. So if 2001 was the end for Sega, it was also the beginning of the end for Nintendo as the industry's luminary, as a company that competed directly with Microsoft and Sony. But for me, the dream was dead, and I would need to decide where I was gonna land. What would be my console of choice throughout my high school years? I had 3 options. The PlayStation hadn't just made gaming acceptable to the masses, it had made gaming cool. Following up on that, the PlayStation 2 was the hottest console the world had ever seen. It is still the hottest console the world has ever seen. Meanwhile, I was posting on Usenet about how much better it would have been if Sony had just stayed out of my beloved video game industry. I blamed them above all others for ruining video games. I blamed their hype machine for killing the Dreamcast, and I was not ever going to get a PS2. Suffice to say that option was out. That meant I could either take a chance on something new and somehow carry an Xbox into my home, or I could stick with Nintendo, the other game maker who would define my childhood, and get a GameCube. I gotta be honest, the Xbox did have my attention. Look at this beautiful behemoth. It was the clear successor to the Dreamcast, the most powerful hardware on the market, pushing the envelope with games for real gamers, and a strong push for online gaming. Even the controllers were similar. Actually, to this day, the Xbox series still uses the Dreamcast button layout, a little piece of Sega's legacy that lives on. And Sega itself was prolific early in the Xbox's life, pumping out exclusive sequels to the Dreamcast's hidden gems, along with other long-forgotten classics. But nobody could stop talking about a little game called Halo. But I was never big into FPSs. What if I didn't like Halo? The Xbox seemed like a risk. Meanwhile, the GameCube seemed like a sure thing, and it came down to 3 factors. My favorite game developer, Sonic Team, said they'd be putting all their focus on GameCube. My other favorite developer, Rare, had been every bit as critical to the N64's success as Nintendo themselves, if not more. And seeing as Nintendo practically owned half the company, Rare would also be exclusive to GameCube. In fact, they'd already revealed a game that I knew I couldn't live without, displayed proudly on the back of the GameCube's original box. My other favorite developer, Nintendo, was sure to push out incredible sequels to my N64 favorites on GameCube. In fact, there already was one, and if anything pushed it over the edge, it was this. That cinched it. The GameCube would be my console of choice. And then something funny happened. The only Sonic Team exclusives for the GameCube were ports of Dreamcast games I'd played to death, a bizarre online card game, and something called Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg? That can't be real. There was never a GameCube exclusive Sonic game, and even if there was, I might have been better off dodging that bullet. I had no way of knowing just how bad it was, but Sega was going through the roughest of rough patches. Rare put out one title for the GameCube, then got sold to Microsoft. I used to look at the back of that box, just dreaming of what might have been. But at least I'd still have Nintendo, right? I expected the GameCube to be to the N64 what the Super Nintendo was to the NES. I expected it to give me refined, polished, next-generation upgrades to all my favorites from the last gen. In fact, there was already a template for that. Melee made the N64 original look like a tech demo. But instead, most of Nintendo's first-party output just kept letting me down. Oh, I got the games I'd wished for, but it was like I'd wished on a monkey's paw. It's like, alright, it might have missed the launch, but the sequel to Mario 64 is finally happening. I played that game day one. I was there the second they opened the doors. And I stopped playing it about 15 shines in. I just got bored. But at least there's always a new Mario Kart. This is gonna be... No, I'm just bouncing around on the menus looking for something that sounds fun. But nothing sounds fun. Oh, okay, but you remember that Kirby racing game they announced way back before the N64 was even out? That's finally finished! And you play it with one button. Oh boy, Donkey Kong is back. Can't wait to see how that's gonna go without... Yeah. It was like Nintendo couldn't get out of their own way. Like they thought innovation for its own sake was the Nintendo difference, and not, you know, the rock-solid game design fundamentals that they'd made their name on? And this was all made even worse by an internal push to stop delaying games. Instead, Nintendo kept pushing them out before they were done cooking. It led to a slate of first-party exclusives that weren't bad, they were just disappointing. They felt a little soulless to me, a little bland, a little corporate. Among the series I knew, there wasn't a single GameCube sequel where I didn't vastly prefer its N64 predecessor. Okay, yeah, except for that one. But the point stands. Every other reason I had for choosing the GameCube, every reason it had seemed like such a sure thing, blew away like dust in the wind. But you know what? I found plenty to love about it anyway. The system was toyetic and fun, but compact and sophisticated, with many discs to match. The controller was godlike and stands among my all-time favorites. And the library had plenty of hidden gems. They were just all immediately relegated to being hidden gems. I was earning my own money for the first time, so I had more games for it than I ever had for anything. I did love that stupid lunchbox, and I say that with affection. I just didn't love it the way that I thought I would. But all the same, it was like the market, the internet, my peers at school, gaming journalism, even the industry itself was just rejecting everything that I liked about games and everything that I wanted them to be. A beautiful new Zelda game that, at least visually, appealed to me more than any of its predecessors was apparently a game for babies, and the fact that they do this to Zelda was indicative of everything wrong with Nintendo. One of my favorite games on the GameCube was The Beautiful Joe. I loved this one. It was one of those system-defining games for me, and it was announced as a GameCube exclusive. I was naive enough to think maybe it'd be a killer app. But nope. Like pretty much every third-party GameCube, quote-unquote, exclusive, it got ported to the PS2. F-Zero GX was developed through a first-of-its-time collaboration between Sega and Nintendo, and the result was such a pure, perfect example of exactly itself that humanity apparently never needed to make another one. I bought it for $9.99, less than 4 months after it was released. The GameCube underperformed so badly, and Nintendo was so backlogged with consoles that weren't selling, they halted production and just stopped making them for almost a year. At stores, I remember the Xbox section was pretty stacked, the PS2 section was so all-encompassing that it basically comprised the entire store, and the GameCube section was increasingly relegated to a piddly little consolation shelf, like, oh, and we also have these toys for Junior. And as the chips fell into place, more and more games that I wanted to play would come out on PS2 and Xbox, but skip Nintendo. I'd go to pick up new GameCube releases, and employees at game stores would make fun of the game I was buying from them right in front of me. I really should have gone somewhere else, but at some point it all just became background noise. I figured, like the Dreamcast before it, maybe I was just destined to be a martyr for failed consoles. I remember back then, whenever somebody found out that I liked games, the question that I would often hear was something like, cool, so are you a PS2 guy or an Xbox guy? I have a GameCube. Why? So, what were people into instead? What, if not Mario, was to be gaming's new standard bearer? In fall 2001, 3 titles would be released that would forever alter player expectations for what video games were, what they could be, and what they should be. And not a one of them released on Nintendo's hardware. Or Sega's, for that matter. The first I mentioned earlier, Halo, a game that codified and revolutionized how first-person shooters would operate on consoles. Calling it a killer app is an understatement. Halo single-handedly raised the FPS from a popular genre to the popular genre. and single-handedly made the Xbox. Not just the console, but the brand. The next was Metal Gear Solid 2, a game that seems now more than ever like it came from the future, raising the bar on cinematic storytelling, environmental storytelling, player agency, and the lack thereof. The third, and inarguably the most influential, was Grand Theft Auto 3. It honestly speaks for itself. The 3D open world as a genre was born in the 6th gen. It would not have been possible on hardware of the previous era. And it was also a turning point for that whole video games could just last point I made earlier. It was a lot harder to justify spending $50 on Crazy Taxi, when for the same price you could get that and so much more in Grand Theft Auto. I mean, sure, maybe GTA's taxi minigame wasn't half as refined as the real thing, but that's the point. How long a game took to beat, how much content it had, was by this time valued high above replayability. In these 3 titles, you can find most of the DNA that defines modern video games. And that's exactly what 2001 meant to gaming. It was a line in the sand separating what video games were from what they were going to be, what they are in a lot of ways to this day. I mean, every generation since has had the same 3 players playing some version of the same roles. If you've ever wondered why Sonic Adventure 2 got pretty good reviews on the Dreamcast, and then 6 months later the GameCube port was just torn to shreds, actually that happened for a lot of reasons. We'd be here literally all day if we talked about all of them. But one reason was just that it had the misfortune of releasing on the other side of those 3 legendary titles. Between June 2001 and February 2002, the measuring stick had changed completely, and expectations for what games needed to strive for to be great were never the same. A few years later, Sega was working on a reboot to one of those niche games that is beloved by Sega fans, a brand new Vector Man game for the PS2. And the product manager, a man named Cord Smith, said something that has always stuck with me. He said, "We're moving away from a kiddie world, a funny, low-key game from the past that served gamers well like 6 years ago. Gamers are now more sophisticated and serious. More intelligent. I think that people are looking forward to something different than what Vector Man was then. This game takes itself, the character, the level design, and the entire set of gameplay elements more seriously than the Vector Man of the past." The game was cancelled a few months later. Nonetheless, this was the attitude that was in vogue at the time. This was what the market wanted, and constantly being told that the games that I loved, the games that I desperately wanted more of, the games that made me love this medium in the first place, were apparently for unsophisticated, unintelligent little babies. It was all just so alienating. Even Sonic chased that trend, and it lost itself in the process. Even the whole reason that I fell in love with gaming in the first place was skewered into something that seemed actively ashamed and resentful of its own legacy. It's really no wonder that after the Dreamcast died, I spent the early to mid-2000s feeling more distant from and disillusioned with gaming than I ever had before. I never stopped playing them, but I wondered how much longer I would. What I couldn't articulate when I wrote those words was that I could feel the winds changing. And I'm sorry, Cord. I didn't want games to take themselves so serious all the time. I didn't want melodramatic stories in the name of so-called maturity or sophistication. I wanted blue skies. I wanted to earn 1-ups when I collected 100 shiny objects. I wanted replay value and twitchy action and challenging level design. I wanted the end of the game to be so brutal and unfair and evil that I felt like I was losing my mind. And when I finally overcame that insurmountable obstacle, I wanted to know that I earned it. I wanted arcade action and mascots with attitude and jump buttons. I wanted Sega, the real Sega, to come back and make a new console and make gaming something I could love again. Above all else, I wanted games to be games, to embrace being games, and to stop trying to appeal to people who didn't even like games. That's what Teen Josh wanted, but like I said, I've had a while to think about it. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think wanting most of those things was okay. Heck, I still want most of those things. We'll circle back to the one that I don't think it's okay to want in a second. But feeling so bitter and resentful and angry about it was a function of my own adolescence. My real issue wasn't that I needed games to have blue skies and bounce attacks, much as that UK resistance campaign might have made me fist pump back then. But no, my real issue was the kinds of games that were driving the growth of the industry just weren't as immediately appealing to me. The design philosophy that works so well in 2D, devs quickly learned, could not be cleanly translated to 3D. There were so many more variables, so much more could go wrong, and so the whole industry basically had to relearn how to even do this. But as the pieces fell into place, I found that I generally did, and generally still do, like 2D games better. I did, and still do, generally like smaller, more tightly focused games a lot better. Back then I saw it starkly, that 3D games were just inherently weaker experiences, but I couldn't wrap my head around the thought that maybe they just weren't as appealing to my tastes. I'm not saying for a second that I don't love 3D games now, or even that I disliked them then. It's just that the syntax where 2D design excels, twitch reflexes, crunchy kinetic action, high replay value, easy to learn but difficult to master, these sort of things hook me, and this is where 2D thrives. But as the industry transitioned to 3D, it set aside a lot of those aspects. The very aspects which, in 2D or 3D, defined Sega's signature approach to game design. The failure of the Dreamcast was also a rejection of that syntax. Arcade action was no longer enough, and it was hard for me not to feel like something was missing. So of course, as a teen, I felt resentful about that. But history has shown that so much of this was just growing pains. The industry, for its own sake, needed to appeal to people who didn't even like games, and make gamers out of them. It did that by, for a while, putting away a lot of the hallmarks of what games were, shedding the reputation the medium had as something that only kids and geeks were gonna be into. Gaming was going through an awkward adolescence at the same time as I was, striving, desiring to be taken more seriously, and feeling way too self-conscious about doing anything that might be perceived as childish. But that's just part of growing up, isn't it? To tell you the truth, maybe that was part of my problem too. It is not lost on me that the games that disappointed me most back then came out of the series that I'd grown up with. Not that I think I'd have loved them either way, I've played them all plenty in the years since, and they've still never clicked with me. But at the time I just took that so personally. I mean, I'd never experienced it before. Caught in between 10 and 20, I went into a game like Double Dash with the expectation that it would not only be a better game than its predecessor, but that it would mean to me what Mario Kart 64 had meant to me. And there was no way it could have. I just didn't have the perspective to know that back then. Cord sucked, but maybe he had a point. Maybe I was more ready than I thought to set my childhood aside for a while. Maybe I did want something a little more sophisticated. Maybe I would have been happier if I'd just gotten an Xbox. Regardless of how I felt about it, regardless of whether I needed to spend a whole generation feeling like a second-class citizen, mainstream acceptance was exactly what gaming had been striving for the whole time. Heck, Sonic himself had been a step in that direction. Even as I wrote those words in 2001, I guarantee 80s kids on the internet were complaining that Sonic, and the rise of Sega, that was where it all went wrong. Because Sonic games were so easy, not like the real games they'd grown up on. I mean, come on, you can take infinite hits as long as you have rings? Even a dumb kid who'd never played a game before could get into that. And I did. You know, maybe part of thinking that games have become too mainstream is just getting old enough to notice that they were always trending that way. The fact that the industry finally broke past that barrier in the early 2000s meant exponential growth. It needed to happen, and I'm glad it did, both for all the people who might not have been here otherwise, and because I would eventually learn everything becomes cool again if you give it enough time. Every renaissance follows a dark age, because eventually, games got over their fear of being too childish, and gamers got over their fear of playing them. Eventually, the most popular game in the world looked like an 8-bit relic running on a 3D engine. Eventually, the most popular game in the world among teenagers was a lighthearted cartoony shooter that doesn't even have any blood. Do you know how unthinkable that would have been when I was a teenager? I started a video game club when I was a junior in high school, okay? Day one, we had about 50 people show up. Then they found out that we wouldn't be playing Halo because it was rated M, and from then on, Video Game Club was down to me and about a dozen of my fellow losers. A lot of the teens I remember would have unleashed hordes upon hordes of homophobic slurs just looking at Fortnite. They'd have never wanted anything to do with it. I mean, I'm sure stuff like that still happens today, but from what I can tell, seriously, you guys are so much kinder than the teens that I remember. Keep it up. Eventually, and I never would have thought this was even possible, but eventually, the GameCube was cool. Cooler than the Xbox, cooler than the PS2, still not cooler than the Dreamcast. But the one demographic Nintendo always had was kids. That made their console terminally uncool. But eventually, those kids grew up. They had no expectations to compare the GameCube against. They have no memories of what gaming discourse was like back then. A consequence of how fast gaming changed is how fast the kinds of games that kids grew up with also changed. It's weird to think about, but for a whole bunch of people just a little bit younger than me, the GameCube is to them what the Genesis and Super Nintendo were to me. It is the glory days. I should have seen it coming. I mean, one of the pillars of my childhood, the Nintendo 64, was often derided in its own time, and for a lot of the same reasons. But in the hearts, minds, and memories of the people who grew up with it, the N64 wasn't a disappointment. It was one of the greatest consoles they'd ever played. So when we grew up, suddenly, the N64 was cool. I saw it happen. I made it happen. So of course it happened to the GameCube, so of course it's happening to the Wii, so it'll keep happening. We've been running this cycle since time immemorial. It's like I've been sucked into an alternate universe, where instead of being uncool because I actually like the GameCube, now I'm uncool because I don't like it enough. Oh, maybe I was just always uncool. In any case, this stupid purple lunchbox is more loved than I ever thought it could be. It took a long time, but time was all it took. 2D wasn't dead forever. Blue skies weren't gone forever. Personal, tightly focused games created by small teams would be viable again. Indies would rise up, DKC would make a return, Sonic would have a renaissance, and Nintendo would learn from their mistakes, forge a new path, and start a revolution that turned the whole industry on its head. In the process, they earned the scorn of a whole new generation of quote-unquote real gamers, but they made me fall in love with their games all over again. Bad times don't last, but good games do. But before the games I liked became cool again, what made even more of a difference in my perspective was just me. You know that trio of landmark titles I talked about earlier? I borrowed some friends' consoles in 2005, and I finally got to see what I'd been missing. I didn't love Halo, but I respected it. I understood why it was so big. As for GTA, San Andreas was out by then, and I played it a ton. I liked it a lot. But I loved Metal Gear Solid 2. I barely played the first one, meaning most of its metatextual tricks went all the way over my head, but that just gave me even more incentive to get into the rest of the series, and I could not get enough of it. There I was, utterly obsessed with the franchise that was pretty much the standard bearer for cinematic storytelling in video games. Metal Gear Solid helped show me that modern games could still be awesome, that something more contemporary and mature could still resonate with me, and that even if I didn't love a game through the same eyes I had as a kid, I could still love it all the same. There I was, learning that maybe it wasn't that video games had started taking themselves too seriously. Maybe it was just me. When the Dreamcast died, I was 12 years old. I was so heartbroken about it that I literally cried. I once heard it described by another wayward Sega fan as the last video game console with a soul, and that always stuck with me. That felt right. When I was 17, for the first time in my life, I bought a video game console with money I'd earned myself, and oh, little Josh would have been so mad at me for this. I did what I said I would never do. I bought a PlayStation 2. It was October 26th, 2005. 5 years to the day since the PS2 came out. 4 years, 8 months, and 26 days since the Dreamcast died. I did it because childhood nostalgia be damned, there were so many incredible games that I'd been missing out on, and above all the others, I needed to play Metal Gear Solid 3. Getting to the point where I could set all those fanboy grievances aside and just let myself love video games again. I must have grown up a lot in the 2000s. I don't intend to ever be finished. Games are just lines of code, and game consoles are just hunks of plastic and silicon. They don't come with souls. The meaning, the importance we attach to them, and the memories we create with them, that's what gives them soul. In so many ways, the 6th generation was the birth of the modern industry. But, and maybe I was too close to see it at the time, but maybe in a sense it was also the last hurrah of the industry I'd fallen in love with as a kid. Just like I needed to set my childhood aside for a while to rediscover my love for those series, maybe I needed that distance from my teen years to see this period with less contempt. To see, let's be honest, the person I was back then with less contempt. I think when I've looked back on this era, what I've always thought of first was my experience living through it. Being a teenager, feeling more and more conflicted as I tried to find that silver lining in the GameCube. But what I seem to have quite cynically forgotten over time is that I did find that silver lining. That aside from a couple of big disappointments and tough losses, the GameCube was still my console of choice. That I espoused its virtues and defended it for a reason, and that I had so many great times finding those hidden gems. And in addition to that, maybe that anti-Sony bias is harder to shake than I thought, because I also don't always give enough credit to what a boundlessly awesome time I had when I finally did get my PS2. Finally got to experience the rest of the generation, or for that matter, how much fun I'm still having now that I finally did get that Xbox. I haven't replayed even most of my favorites of this era in years, and there's still so much I missed out on. Like, I bought this the other day on a whim, and it's one of those games where I'm mad at myself for not playing it sooner. I could have been playing this for the last 18 years! In the early 2000s, gaming came closer than it ever has to losing me, and I never would have thought I'd look back on it with much affection. But here I am anyway, missing those growing pains. Missing when games were a little more wild and a little more experimental, when gameplay systems weren't so streamlined and standardized and rote, and controller layouts were anything but standardized. When even at the upper echelons of the industry, publishers were more willing to take risks. It was a time of great strife, upheaval, and innovation, but video games still had cheat codes. It was the 6th generation of video games. Maybe they weren't the glory days of 16-bit, but they sure seem close now. Hope you enjoyed the video, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, you keep geekin', I'll keep critiquin'.